This episode of Lines of Inquiry is supported by Shopify. If you've ever bought something online, there's a good chance you've seen it. The purple Shop Pay button at checkout. For many shoppers, it's a familiar sight because it means a faster checkout, secure and saved details, and a smoother buying experience. What many people don't realise is that button is powered by Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world, from household names to brands just getting started. For business owners, Shopify provides hundreds of ready-to-use templates that allow you to create a professional online store without writing a single line of code. It also allows you to manage everything in one place: inventory, payments, analytics, and more. And when it comes to growing your audience, Shopify includes built-in marketing and email tools to help you reach new customers. Then there's that purple Shop Pay button, already trusted by millions of businesses around the world and designed to deliver one of the best converting checkouts available, which is exactly why so many businesses choose Shopify. If you want to see fewer abandoned carts, it's time to head over to Shopify. Sign up for your €1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.ie. From Lines of Inquiry, this is Incident Brief. Stopping the Dublin terror attack. My name is John Sweetman. For 25 years I worked as a detective in forensic science and crime scene investigation within the Garda Technical Bureau. In Lines of Inquiry, Incident Brief, I examine cases, overlooked incidents, and stories that sit outside our main investigations. These are the cases that don't always make a full file, but still deserve to be told. This is what we know. In June 2021, armed Gardaí carried out a search at a hostel on Gardiner Street in Dublin, arresting a man named Mark Wolfe. But that wasn't his only name. The British national had been living there under a number of different aliases. What Gardaí found inside the room did not point to one clear crime. There was no single item that defined the case. But taken together, each piece began to form a pattern, and that pattern deeply disturbed Gardaí. Following the search of the room, Gardaí recovered what they described as a tactical weapons kit, which included a number of firearm components, instructions on how to put them together, along with barrels and scopes. They also found several passports, all in different names, as well as a 3D printer and equipment to fabricate gun parts. A number of mobile devices were also found. When these were later examined, they contained reams of right-wing, violent extremist ideology. It was the examination of those devices that shifted the understanding of what Gardaí were dealing with. On the phone, investigators also found child sexual abuse material, evidence of activity on hidden online networks, and terror-related content, including gruesome footage of the attack on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019. That shooting left 51 people dead and 89 others injured. Taken together, it was clear this was a man who was collecting the building blocks to carry out a terrorist attack, with an interest in extreme violence. Mark Wolfe did not arrive in Ireland without a history. By that point, he was already known to police in the United Kingdom, where he had been linked to serious offences, including terrorism-related activity and child sexual offences. He had previous convictions in England for assault causing grievous bodily harm, firearm offences and battery. Wolfe was not operating under the radar. He was a man already on the system, with serious red flags, already under scrutiny and already raising concern. As the net closed on him in London, Wolfe fled the UK. The 37-year-old slipped away to Ireland, and far from keeping a low profile, Wolfe, now a wanted man, picked up exactly where he left off. But his plan had shifted, and he was beginning to lay the groundwork for a terror attack not in his home country, but in Dublin, Ireland. An attack that would be unlike anything Ireland had experienced. Gardaí were in a race against time to catch him before his plan became reality. This is the story of the Gardiner Street lone wolf. In mid-2021, Ireland was still living in the long shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic. Level 5 restrictions, the most serious on the scale, were not long after easing. Hotels and some outdoor leisure facilities had reopened earlier that June. Life was returning, but at no great pace. HSE testing facilities would not be shuttered until a year later. It would be another 3 months before public transport would return to full capacity. The news still carried nightly case numbers. Keeping a low profile in lockdown was easy in the north inner city of Dublin. Gardiner Street sits just north of the heart of Dublin city, running up from O'Connell Street, the main thoroughfare of the capital, as far as Dorset Street, into an area of older Georgian buildings, many of which have long since changed use. Once the home of wealthy aristocrats, the 4-storey red bricks devolved into the slums and tenements of the early 19th century. Today, a significant number of these buildings operate as hostels, budget accommodation, and small hotels, catering to a constant turnover of short-term stays. It's a transient stretch of Dublin's fair city. Backpackers, seasonal workers, people between places, people moving on a shoestring, and lost folk with nowhere else to go gravitate towards Gardiner Street. Rooms booked for a night, or a week, or longer. Shared spaces and minimal interaction. The perfect place to keep out of sight. It's the kind of place where anonymity comes easily, where someone can check in under a name with very few questions asked, keep to themselves and not draw much attention, and where, if they want to, they can disappear into the background. Mark Wolfe wasn't arriving as a tourist, or someone passing through for a short stay. By the time he reached Dublin, police in the UK were deeply concerned about what he might do. Wolfe, who had also used the names Mark Peppard and Mark Nolan before coming to Ireland, was the subject of bench warrants in the United Kingdom after failing to appear in court on serious charges. Those proceedings involved allegations of terrorism offences, along with offences connected to indecent images of children. When those matters later came before the High Court in Dublin, further detail emerged about what already had been uncovered in the UK. According to the warrant, 2 searches had been carried out at Wolfe's home on Britannia Street in Camden, London, on the 10th of October 2018 and the 25th of February 2020. Police seized Wolfe's laptop. What they found on it was shocking and disturbing. Investigators found a large volume of child sexual abuse material, more than 250,000 sick and perverted images, along with internet manuals and documents for making improvised weapons and explosives. There were 8 videos of child sexual abuse material found on Wolfe's phone. These were linked to a group known as Lolly Island and involved children aged between 3 and 11. Police recovered Snapchat conversations with 2 teenage girls. In one exchange, both Wolfe and a 16-year-old girl were recorded engaging in sexual acts from separate locations. In a second conversation, involving a girl aged between 12 and 14, Wolfe sent an image of his penis and attempted to engage the child in sexual activity, at one point presenting himself as being 12 years old. In April 2021, just before Wolfe was due to stand trial on these charges, he went on the run. An international arrest warrant was issued. Within weeks, he had set up shop in Dublin, living under different names, staying in temporary accommodation on Gardiner Street. He didn't miss a beat. He began again to acquire components that could be used in the construction of firearms. Caught in the UK, due to face justice, he fled here and started the same sick plot. According to Forensic Science Ireland, the Irish investigation into Mark Wolfe began after Counter-Terrorism International were contacted by police in the United Kingdom. British authorities were seeking information on Wolfe. That contact matters. because it is the point at which this case moves from background to active investigation. Gardaí took this seriously. Here was a man wanted on terrorist offences, child grooming and assaulting a police officer. They were dealing with a very dangerous man, already linked to serious offences in another jurisdiction, now present in Ireland and believed to be attempting to acquire weapons that could be used in a mass murder or terror attack. What followed was not a single action, but a process of good police work, an investigation that combined intelligence received from abroad with activity taking place here on the ground in Dublin. Some solid forensic work to boot. Gardaí discovered Wolf had been receiving packages at the address on Gardiner Street. These were not random deliveries or unrelated items. They were components sourced from multiple jurisdictions, including Asia and the Netherlands, and they were capable of being used in the construction of guns. Among those items were triggers, springs, and other internal parts, the kind of components that on their own pass through postal systems without immediate concern, bought from different vendors to avoid arousing suspicion, but which become far more significant when viewed together. What investigators look for in a case like this is not any single item, but the pattern those items form over time. In this case, that pattern became clear. Repeated deliveries, interchangeable components, and instructions outlining how those parts could be assembled into weapons. Equipment capable of producing additional parts through the 3D printer were also found in his room. It all pointed to preparation, potentially for something major, and that is the point at which the focus of an investigation changes. It is no longer about understanding what has already happened, but about assessing what may be about to happen. For Gardaí, that meant moving the case into the hands of specialist units, including the Garda Special Detective Unit, whose role is to investigate threats to the security of the state. From there, the priority was about establishing what had been acquired, to understand how those components fit together, and to determine, as far as possible, how close Mark Wolf was to being able to commit an act of domestic terror in Dublin. Because in cases involving a lone gunman terrorist, they are almost impossible to stop. There is no wider network to monitor, no group structure to penetrate, no potential weakness or vulnerability to exploit. Even the most advanced and resourced investigators in the world do not intercept and stop the majority of these people. What you are dealing with is one person, operating largely alone, moving step by step towards capability. Often, they are leaving very little trace of their actions or intentions along the way. That is what makes cases like this so difficult from an investigative point of view. When there is no obvious organisation, no chain of command, and no wider conspiracy to map out, almost everything depends on recognising the significance of small steps by a single individual before they become something larger. Doing that before the person carries out their plan is no simple task. It requires vigilance, foresight, and dedication. A purchase of a manual, a printer, a spring, a trigger, all of these things can sit separately without immediately revealing the danger they represent. But when they began to arrive in one letterbox on Gardiner Street, and when they began to gather around one individual already known to investigators in another jurisdiction, the room for doubt started to narrow. By June 2021, Gardaí had reached the point where the risk could no longer be left to develop. They didn't have a smoking gun, both in the literal and figurative sense. They had pieces of the puzzle. They decided it was enough to understand what Wolf was planning. They decided to swoop. Wolf was arrested at the hostel on Gardiner Street on foot of an extradition warrant from the UK police, and the room where he had been staying was searched. What followed is the part of police work the public usually never sees in full. Not the dramatic breach of the door, the shouting or the arrest itself, but the slower, more methodical process that comes afterwards, when every item is photographed, bagged, labelled, logged, and sent for examination. This is where a case either starts to come together or falls apart. Many of the components recovered during the search were found inside a bag with no obvious identifier linking them to Wolf or any other person. That posed an immediate problem for the Gardaí. Investigators also identified material relating to both legal and illegal immigration, along with videos depicting extreme violence, primarily directed at people of colour. When the Garda Special Detective Unit carried out the search of Wolf's hostel room on Gardiner Street in Dublin, they recovered a rubber face mask, a badge bearing the Garda logo, and military-style body armour. They also found military goggles and gloves, along with a number of tents and military sleeping bags. A black flag depicting the Sonnenrad, or Black Sun, a symbol associated with neo-Nazi ideology and used by the perpetrator of the Christchurch attack, was also recovered. Recovering suspicious items from a room is one thing. Proving to the criminal standard that will satisfy a court that they were possessed and handled by the accused is another. In practical terms, that meant forensic scientists had to do what Gardaí and the DPP cannot do on suspicion alone. They had to connect the physical evidence directly to Mark Wolf. The most important part of that work came down to fingerprints. Forensic examiners developed 43 finger marks from the items submitted to them. 19 were identified to Wolf. His prints were identified 14 separate times on plastic packaging that contained internal mechanical components used in the construction of semi-automatic guns. This evidence was crucial. The parts and him being in the same room isn't enough. They needed evidence of contact with the parts themselves, again and again across different pieces of packaging and material. That is the difference between proximity and possession, and it is often the difference between suspicion and proof, guilty and not guilty. Because once those marks are identified, the argument that these were merely items found in a space becomes much harder to sustain. The evidence now points not simply to presence, but to handling, familiarity, and repeated interaction with the pieces at the centre of the puzzle. The physical evidence was only one side of the investigation. The digital examination of the phones was moving in parallel, and that is where the case again took a sinister turn. Until then, Gardaí were looking at gun components, manuals, shipments, and equipment. Serious enough in themselves. But the phones revealed a much darker overlap between violent ideology, child sexual offences, and disturbing online behaviour. The court heard that the devices seized in Ireland, like the phones and laptop taken from him in the UK, contained child sexual abuse material, extremist imagery, and Nazi-related materials. At that point, the investigation was no longer simply about what might have happened next. It was also about harm that had already been done, stored, shared, and carried on phones in that room on Gardiner Street. In March 2023, Mark Wolf appeared before the Dublin Circuit Criminal Court for sentencing. He had pleaded guilty to a series of offences, including multiple counts relating to the possession of component parts of a firearm, the importation of those components into the state, and the possession of an electronic document containing instructions on how firearms could be assembled. He also pleaded guilty to offences relating to the possession of child sexual abuse material on his devices. With Wolf pleading guilty to those offences, it removed the need for a full trial. In court, the judge heard how the case had been built, the pattern of deliveries, the recovery of components, documentation explaining how those parts could be assembled, the forensic evidence linking Wolf directly to those items, the fingerprints that proved beyond reasonable doubt that he had been handling this stuff, and the disturbing images and videos found on his devices, placing his actions within a wider context of extremist ideology and predatory behaviour towards children. According to Forensic Science Ireland, investigators believed Wolf was in the advanced stages of planning a lone terrorist attack. That conclusion wasn't drawn from any one item in the room, but from how everything fit together. The components, the instructions, the pattern of activity, and what had already been uncovered on his devices. At the same time, there was one detail that stood out. At the point he was arrested, he did not have access to ammunition. Investigators later described that as significant. It no doubt played a part in his sentence. It didn't change the direction he was moving in, but it does speak to where this case sat and where Wolf was within his own mission. Not at the beginning and not at the end, but somewhere in between. There was also evidence outlined in court that investigators had identified that Wolf had looked into acquiring explosives. Contact details for a commercial supplier, the kind used in legitimate industrial work like quarrying and construction, were found on his devices. No explosives were recovered and no purchase had been completed, but the presence of that material added another grim layer to the picture. It showed that the focus was not fixed on a single method, that of a lone shooter. It showed Gardaí that Wolf was already exploring other ways to cause carnage, including bombs and explosives. By the time the case came before the court, Gardaí and the DPP understood what had been done and how it had been done. But there was less clarity around the man himself and what had brought Mark Wolf to that point in his life. The court heard details of his background, that he had left school at a young age, dropping out at the age of 12 in order to care for his mother, who was suffering from schizophrenia. It also outlined that he had a history of mental health difficulties himself and had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. All of that formed part of the picture presented at sentencing, but it did not change the central issue in the case or offer any explanation or excuse for his actions. In passing sentence, Judge Martin Nolan imposed a term of 10 years imprisonment for the firearms offences, with concurrent sentences for the remaining charges. The sentence was backdated to June 2021, when Wolf had first been taken into custody. There is a tendency, after cases like this, to focus on what was recovered, the parts, the files, the evidence. But what matters more is how close it came to becoming something else altogether. Not an incident brief, not a quiet court case, but a day that would have wreaked devastation on Dublin, the likes of which had never been seen before. That line between preparation and action is often much thinner than we'd like to admit, and in this case, it was crossed in the other direction, stopped before it could move any further. Like other cases we have covered on Lines of Inquiry, this was an example of preventative policing. Often the kind of hard work that demands dedication and vigilance, but is seen far less than the police work that comes when a violent act has already been carried out. This time, that preventive police work meant lives saved, and a terror attack that never happened, and a plot being pieced together in a small room on Gardiner Street was stopped before it could become reality. Thank you for listening to this episode of Lines of Inquiry Incident Brief. Lines of Inquiry is presented by me, John Sweetman. The podcast is created by Darren Cleary. Our executive producer is Eoin Brennan. Siobhan Walsh, Aoife Plunkett and Siobhan Maguire are our producers. This episode was written by Darren Cleary and edited by Eoin Brennan. Sound design and editing by Neil Kavanagh. Legal, marketing and social media support comes from the team at GoLoud. If you would like to support the series, we'd really appreciate it. Please share it with a friend on WhatsApp, post it to your social media, or simply recommend it to someone you know. It makes a real difference. Please leave a comment here if you're listening on Spotify. Join me next time as we open another case and follow the evidence wherever it leads. Because in the end, everything done in the dark comes to light.